What is up, guys? It's your buddy Blue Spooky here with another daily video. Your standard 1 hour and 30-minute affair. If you guys end up enjoying this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite things about doing these videos is reading your guys' comments, even if I can't always respond to them. Last but not least, if you'd like to go that extra step and support the channel even more than you do by just watching the video already, go ahead and click that join button next to the subscribe button. It's $2 a month at the lowest tier, and you get a special icon next to your name when you comment, and special emoticons that you can use when you comment as well. No content will be locked behind the paywall, of course. It's simply something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel a little more. Either way, I will get right into the video, and I hope you guys enjoy the true scary stories. Thanks for watching. I used to work for a small trucking company that would deliver frozen product to stores across several states. For the most part, I would do 3 or 4 deliveries before heading back to the warehouse and then heading home. Every once in a while, though, we would have a long delivery round, where we would end up too far to head back that same day. We would have to sleep somewhere overnight before heading back. Usually, I just pull over the truck into a truck stop and rest for a few hours, then get back on the road. Anyway, I was scheduled for a long delivery on this day, and I knew I wouldn't get back until pretty late the next day. I got ready and headed out. Nothing really happened the entire way there. I drove the route, unloaded the truck, and started to head back. It was pretty late though, around 1 in the morning or so. I figured I should stop and rest for an hour or two before continuing on the way back. The last sign I'd seen for a truck stop said 40 miles ahead though, so I still had quite a bit of a ways to go before getting there. I tend to space out for long periods of time when driving down long straight roads, especially this late at night when nobody else is out driving. All of a sudden though, I thought I saw something flickering in my side mirror. I looked over and noticed headlights shining from right behind the trailer. I couldn't see the car that these were coming from at all though. Usually that meant the car was in my blind spot, too close to the back for me to see. I continued down the road at the same speed, waiting for this car to get into the other lane and pass me by. To my surprise though, whoever this was staying right behind me at the exact same distance. This was starting to really bother me. I knew if I had to brake for any reason, this guy was for sure going to hit me. The truck stop was just a few miles ahead though, so I tried to ignore them for the rest of the way there. Finally, I saw the sign for the rest area and started to pull in. As I was turning, I checked my mirrors again and saw the car start to slow down. They continued to follow me, even into the parking lot. I honestly wasn't sure what to make of this at this point. I figured maybe I'd accidentally cut him off a while back or something, and he wanted to scream at me about it. I'd gotten a lot of angry drivers in my years of trucking, so I was pretty used to being yelled at. I'd never had someone follow me like this though. I pulled into an open spot and shifted into park. The car slowly trailed in behind me and got closer and closer to the back before eventually stopping. Once again, they had parked too close for me to actually see them in the mirrors. At this point, I was getting a bit weirded out. I got out and started walking around to the back to question them. Almost as soon as I slammed my driver door shut though, they slammed it in reverse and drove away in such a rush that I couldn't even see their license plate. I could tell that whoever was driving was an older man though. The car was white and had patches of rust all over. It looked somewhat similar to one of those old police cars with the front bumper bars. I stood out there by the back of the truck for a couple of minutes, making sure everything was still securely locked and that the person wouldn't be coming back. I then got back in the truck and turned it off. I double-checked all the doors to make sure they were locked, and did one quick glance out all the windows to make sure there were no more cars around. Then I laid back and closed my eyes. All of a sudden, I heard a bang echo through my trailer. I checked my watch and saw that almost 2 hours had passed by, and now it was a little past 3 a.m. There was another loud bang, this time even louder. I looked over in the side mirror and saw a faint shadow moving around towards the back. This time I got really freaked out. I grabbed the small knife I kept in the middle compartment and started making my way back there. This time, though, I left the driver's door open so as to not make any noise. As I got closer, I crouched down a little and looked underneath the trailer. I could clearly see someone standing right up against the back of the truck. Their car was right behind them, with its headlights turned off. Once I saw that, a rush of fear ran through my body. I decided not to approach any further, and instead shouted out to them. My voice was admittedly a little bit shaky, but it seemed to do the trick. They rushed into their car and sped off. Looking at the back door, there were scratches all over the lock, and clear marks as if they were trying to cut it open. I looked around to see if any other trucks could have seen the incident, but the lot was pretty empty. After a couple of minutes, I ended up just getting back on the road and headed straight home. Nothing else happened for the rest of the trip. I always assumed this was just a guy trying to steal from my trailer, but obviously he didn't know I was on my way back from a delivery, and the whole trailer was empty. Anyways, it was still pretty unnerving. This happened to me during my early years of trucking, and I still get paranoid sometimes, with a feeling a car may be following right behind me, without me being able to see them. Last year, 3 friends and I went motorbiking along the mountain paths of Yuta Takayama. We took a break in the rest area. It looked kind of cool actually, like an old cabin. It was pretty great because there was no one else around really. One of my friends, let's call him A, was laying down and stretching out on the bench. Another friend, who we'll call B, was taking in the scenery. It was extremely beautiful in this area. I guess we had stayed there relaxing for about 30 minutes or so, when black clouds began to gather overhead. It looked as if a downpour was on the cards. I quickly headed toward the sheltered area by the bench that A was lying down at. He was fast asleep, so I shook him awake. He wouldn't wake up though. He was out like a light. As the thunderstorm stirred and raged, we noticed an elderly couple who'd suddenly appeared to take shelter. "Hey there, it's a real weatherly nightmare, isn't it?" The old man replied. "Yeah, it truly is." As B and I talked, the old couple sat there in silence and just stared at A, who was still sleeping. I found this couple very creepy. I didn't like the way they were staring at my friend. I didn't want to stick around them for much longer. The thunder was cracking all around us though, and it made me and B jump up in surprise. Apparently, it was loud enough to wake A up as well. He shot up straight away and said, "Did you see their faces?" I had no idea what he was talking about. I looked around and noticed that the old couple were now gone. B seemed confused. He ran out of the hut only to come back in and say there were only our bikes in the parking area. Where the hell did that old couple go? We were out in the middle of the mountains. It was impossible to get around by foot out here. Man, I can't feel that horrible feeling anymore. We asked A what he was talking about. While I was sleeping, I felt something terrible, kind of like a nightmare. I opened my eyes and that elderly couple was approaching me. When they sat down, I pretended to be asleep. "Oh, so you were awake the whole time? You heard us talking then?" Yeah, for some reason I really didn't want those guys to come near me. My friend was shaking out. He was really stressed out, and their disappearance seemed to have rattled him. He always liked to pretend to be asleep when something was about to go down. We really have no idea what was going on with that couple or why they gave off such a strange and ominous feeling. "4 years ago, I rented an Airbnb to stay in for the holidays. I was seeing my family for the week of Christmas, so I got a place that was just a few miles away. When I arrived on December 20th, everything was exactly as I thought it would be. The place was a very regular house in a very normal neighborhood. Overall, I was satisfied. I'd gotten there around 6 on that first day, though, and didn't feel like going out to see anyone, at least not until I'd gotten a good night's rest first. I stayed in and relaxed for the rest of the night, watching some TV and even getting a little bit of work done as well. I got in bed just before 10 p.m. and fell asleep quite quickly. In the middle of the night, though, I slowly woke up to a noise coming from downstairs. I was still half asleep and didn't even check the time. It sounded like small thumps against the wall, coming from somewhere inside the house. As I listened to these noises, I didn't really feel worried or anything. Rather, it almost sounded like it was the house making those noises they tend to do at night sometimes. I only stayed awake for a minute or so before drifting into sleep once again. I don't recall waking up any other times during the night. By morning, I had forgotten and didn't even think about the noises I was hearing again. I was pretty sure it was just the unit creaking or something along those lines. Anyway, I let my family know I'd made it into town, and we got our plans set for dinner at their place. I relaxed at the Airbnb for the whole morning and afternoon until I was ready to head out. I grabbed my bag and keys, and then walked up to the front door to exit the house. When I opened it, to my surprise, I found myself standing face to face with a man who was just waiting out on my porch. Needless to say, it completely caught me off guard, and I just stood there looking at him for a second, before even saying anything. "Can I help you?" I asked the man. He didn't knock or ring the doorbell or anything, which made me start wondering, how long could he have just been standing there for, and why was he here to begin with? The man did not respond to my question, though. Instead, he nodded and walked away. I watched him go down to the sidewalk and just continue walking down the street until he was out of sight. I couldn't see any situation where this wouldn't be strange and creepy. Why was he at the Airbnb, and for how long had he just been waiting there outside without attempting to make contact? I made sure the place was locked up tight, then drove to my parents' house for dinner with the family. I brought up the situation as an interesting story, and everyone else seemed to think it was just as creepy as I did. Dinner was quite nice, and we had plenty of other great conversations, catching up on life and everything. That whole night, though, I couldn't stop thinking about that strange man, and if the things I'd left at the Airbnb were going to be stolen or something by the time I got back. I ended up leaving the dinner get-together at around 9, and getting back to the Airbnb about 15 minutes later. I parked in the driveway and walked up to the front door, looking around for any obvious signs of someone having been there while I was gone. I didn't see anything out of place. I unlocked the door and stepped in. I walked down to the end of the hallway and into the kitchen, dropping my keys and the bag on the counter. Then there was a sudden thump, just the same as the ones I'd heard the previous night. Now that I was downstairs, it was far louder and clearly coming from one side of the house. I slowly stepped into the room near where the sound was coming from, but then the thump came again, from a door right next to me. I jumped back, getting a surge of adrenaline. After staring at the door for a few seconds, I could hear the faint sounds of heavy breathing coming from the other side. I grabbed my keys and ran for my car. I still didn't know exactly what was going on here, but I was not going to stick around to find out all on my own. I called 911 and waited for them to arrive. When they did, I watched them go in and search for a few minutes. Then they came out and told me something horrifying. The door this person was behind was the garage door, which showed signs of distress from the person likely trying to break the lock and get inside. Unbeknownst to me, there was a side door connected to the garage that led outside, which had been left unlocked by whoever had stayed there before me. I didn't ever plan to use the garage, so I'd never bothered to check it. Whether the man I'd seen on the porch was the same person that was in the garage is unknown, but just knowing I was asleep while someone was right below me trying to break into the house is terrifying. What were they trying to achieve after breaking in? We have no way of knowing. Obviously, after that though, I went and stayed at a hotel for the rest of the week instead. I still find myself thinking about that situation, even 4 years later. This happened when I was in my early 20s. I was working in a retail store in a mall, but there weren't enough hours to go around. I asked if there was anything else I could do. My boss told me the location of another mall that needed more people, so I could go there on my weekends. I needed to take the bus route that was a bit longer, but I didn't have to make any transfers at least. I got up early and caught the earliest one I could. The bus ride was fairly normal. I got to see parts of my city that I hadn't seen before. I did notice the bus eventually went through a more dingy neighborhood. There was more trash everywhere, abandoned buildings and houses, abandoned cars as well. I noticed it, but I felt like I was safely on the bus, and my destination was in a nice neighborhood anyway. At some point, an older lady got on the bus, and I noticed that no one was getting up to offer her a seat. I gave her mine and went to go hold the pole next to the side door of the bus. I continued on my way. While riding, I remember looking at a guy next to me and asking if he knew about how much longer it would take to get to my stop. Before he answered, though, someone hit the buzzer to get off. The doors next to me opened, and then I felt hands on my free arm, grabbing me and pulling me. On reflex, I clenched up immediately, because I generally don't like any physical contact with strangers outside of a greeting or a handshake. I really think that reflex saved my life, because it took my brain a few seconds to register that someone was trying to pull me off the bus right now. A tall man in a white tank top, blue jeans, and white tennis shoes had come out of the back of the bus and grabbed my arm and was trying to drag me off right now. He'd pulled me down to the second step before I even knew what was going on. I was just barely hanging onto the pole. The arm he was grabbing had my purse on it, so I actually tried to shake my purse down to him so he'd let go. He had no interest, though. I had just about started calling for help when I felt someone grab my waist and pull me back up towards the bus. The man trying to pull me down must have realized he could no longer get me out without dragging this on longer than he'd expected. So he finally gave up and ran off. That was it. The guy ran off, the door shut once again, and I vaguely remember hearing the man who saved me say something along the lines of, "You might die if you get off in that neighborhood." I had apparently gone into some sort of shock because I only remember saying, "Oh." I don't even remember thanking him. I didn't say anything to the driver. I didn't contact the police like I should have. I don't even remember my shift at the other location. I don't remember the ride home either. It's like I just went numb. When I was back at home and had completely showered and gotten ready for bed in my nightgown, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about what happened. Did I almost get kidnapped in front of a bus full of people? I had a lot of regrets about this. I regret not contacting the police in case the guy went after another woman. At least then a woman would be aware he was out there. I regret not thanking and keeping contact with that nice person who saved me. I actually posted an article in my local Craigslist in hopes of him somehow hearing it and knowing how grateful I am. My sister and I went to a Jack in the Box during the summer of 2016. We grabbed our stuff and sat at the table closest to the window. Honestly, I really hated being alone in that place. It didn't make me feel that much better being with my sister either. Something about that area was just weird. I suddenly remembered that I should buy my mom some food to bring back home to her as well. I got up to the counter and ordered her some food, then rejoined my sister. As I came back though, I noticed my sister now looked quite frightened and weirded out. She said that this weird-looking homeless guy kept on staring at her. We both turned around in our booth and tried to eat our food, ignoring this weird guy. What happened next completely terrified me though. All of a sudden, another guy began running out of the store with this little girl. I thought she must have still been in school. She looked like she was 5 or 6 years old. Maybe they were running out like that because it was early in the morning and they were late for school or something. We were eating there pretty early. I was terribly wrong though. It took me a moment to remember that day was actually a school holiday. No one would be running to get to school. Plus, the look on their faces looked like they were both quite creeped out. I could feel knots in my stomach suddenly. My sister grabbed me by the arm and practically dragged me out of there. I tugged my arm away, quite confused and surprised. I asked her what was wrong. She kept staring behind me back into the restaurant. Well, if that father and daughter were running away, they had to be running away from something. We need to leave too. I turned around to look back, only to see that coming out of the doors of the Jack in the Box was that same homeless man. He was looking at my sister still and had what looked to be a knife in his hand. He was smiling, revealing a lot of missing teeth. He began stumbling towards us, slowly but surely moving. We ran away from him. All the while, we could hear him calling her name, my sister's name, perfectly. Neither of us, to this day, have any idea how that man even knew it. It really makes me wonder how long that man must have been watching my sister. After that, we never went back to that Jack in the Box ever again. If you ever go out like that, even when you're with somebody, always be aware of your surroundings, because there's no telling what might happen around you at any moment. What that man could have done had we not noticed him in time could have been quite a lot worse. This happened back in 2021. I, 27 and female, had just moved from Melbourne to rural Australia to live with my fiancé. At that time, he was still only my boyfriend. He was 29 and was on military posting at the army base. The town we moved to was pretty isolated, about 4 to 5 hours to reach any large city in each direction. It was still big enough though, with a few different suburbs surrounding the main area. Neither of us really knew the area at all before moving, and this led us to get a house in a pretty sketchy part of town. I'll try to explain the setup of the house first, as this will be important later. The house we moved into was quite old. It had huge glass windows everywhere, including the entirety of the front of the house. Because of this, you could easily see into the kitchen, living room, and one of the unused bedrooms without coming down the driveway. There was an old metal fence to the left of the house, which was about 1.5 meters tall. It led directly into the backyard. To the right of the house was a small path, hidden by an overgrowth of bush and plants from the front. With a locked gate, the height of the house that led to the back semi-enclosed patio and back door. The path was right next to the kitchen window. You couldn't exactly see out when the light was on, but you could see in if you were outside. When coming in through the back door from the patio, you would walk through the laundry with an adjacent bathroom, into the kitchen with our bedroom off to the left, and a second one directly next to ours. My boyfriend was out doing military stuff for a week, so I had been home alone. It was summer during this time, and it was quite hot. The house had terrible AC, so I had been sleeping with the windows open, and even left the back door wide open on accident when falling asleep a few times. I've always felt safe in Australia and have lived mostly alone ever since I was 18. I didn't really have an issue with it. It comes to Friday, my 5th day there alone, and I decided to walk into town and find something to do. The walk took about an hour each way, and when I finally got home, I was looking forward to doing nothing besides getting out of this heat. I spent most of the afternoon in the living room, playing PlayStation and watching TV. I had heard a few weird noises, though, down the side of the house on the path next to the kitchen, leading to the patio. The guy who lived next to us had a workshop of some kind, though, so I assumed it must have just been him tinkering around. I'm one of those people who lay in bed before they're ready to go to sleep. As I laid there, around 10 p.m. or so, I was doing my nightly scroll of Reddit. This really saved my ass, as I read a story that prompted me to get up out of bed and go close and lock the back door, which I'd almost forgotten to do. The back door had a normal lock, then a reinforced deadlock with a key screwed into the wall. 45 minutes or so later, still hearing the neighbor tinkering around occasionally, I decided I was ready to actually go to bed. I go and start turning off all the lights, including the back patio light and kitchen light. I lay down in bed and am finishing up my mindless scrolling when I hear the noises again. This time, though, it was much louder. Still, it could just be that the guy was working in his workshop even harder, or maybe some kind of animal rustling things around. I was about to put down my phone and write it off, when suddenly, I heard a loud bang at my back door. I instantly felt like everything was going in slow motion. I just knew someone was kicking the back door in. I thought to myself, this cannot be happening. Then came another bang, and another. It was all so loud, and it felt like the house itself was shaking. I could hear multiple points of glass shattering, and the banging continuing. This went on for what felt like an eternity, but was only a few minutes. In my panic, after the second or third bang, thinking I could scare them off by pretending a man was here, I yelled out in the deepest voice I could, then slammed my bedroom door closed. Obviously, that didn't really work. I locked it and called 000, then pushed my bed up against the door. The banging was still going on, even as I called the police. Just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. There was nowhere else to hide, so I was crouched down in the corner of the room near my bed. While on the phone with police, I could hear someone starting to kick in the bedroom door as well. I was screaming at this point. I don't even remember what I was saying to the operator, or what they were saying to me. I remember praying the police arrived before these people got inside my room. I could hear sirens. The banging on the bedroom door stopped immediately, and I saw torches shining into the bedroom window. Because I was so scared, I couldn't really comprehend what the operator was saying to me. I had no idea if those torchlights were whoever had just kicked in my back door and bedroom door, or if it was the police finally arriving. Now, I don't remember how I realized this, but it turned out it was the police outside. The next thing I remember, I was in the kitchen surrounded by 10 officers, crying and trying to explain what had happened. I was so inconsolable that the police had to use my boyfriend's army photos on the fridge to get his details to call the duty officer to allow him to come home. Once I calmed down a bit and my boyfriend got back, I saw the back gate to the patio was completely broken. The bedroom door was cracked, and the back door had been thrown off its hinges, with the deadlock completely ripped out of the wall. The laundry window had been smashed in as well. There were 2 sets of clear footprints on the door from where they had kicked the door in. I checked my phone and called 000 at 12:04 a.m. and had been on the phone for less than 5 minutes. What I think happened is that they must have followed me back from my walk. They could easily see from the road that I was alone and had been watching me on the path next to the kitchen for the evening. The noises I thought were the neighbor tinkering must have been them, and once I turned the lights off, they finally made their move. I don't think they anticipated the back door would be so hard to break down though, which is why they smashed the laundry room window. They couldn't unlock the deadbolt without the key though, so I guess they broke it down somehow. Luckily, that extra time saved me from whatever they were trying to do. The guys weren't ever caught, and we ended up moving house within the next few weeks. My boyfriend and I even ended up breaking up, as he was regularly out on duty and I couldn't stand to be home at night anymore. I would panic, cry, and not sleep until the sun would come up, and it put too much strain on the relationship. It wasn't until later that I realized I was experiencing PTSD, and after I worked through it, we got back together. I now live back in my home city in an apartment building that has 24/7 security, a billion cameras, and I got 2 dogs as well. I'm 22 now, but this happened when I was 16. At the time, I lived in Staten Island, New York. For a little background, I'm a woman, and at the time I was 120 pounds soaking wet, with a height of 5'6". I thought I was invincible. I never imagined anything like this would have ever happened to me. It was March 17th of 2013, around 10:30 p.m. or so. I was leaving my boyfriend's house. He'd walked me to the local bus stop as he always did. We joked and laughed while we waited for my bus to show up. It was kind of late. There weren't many cars on the street. I happened to notice a black SUV parked right across the road. I didn't think too much of it at the moment. My bus eventually did show up, and I said goodbye to my boyfriend. I boarded and took a seat next to the bus driver. The bus was completely empty. The driver turned to me once we hit the first red light, and then he asked, "What are you doing out this late?" It was random and a bit creepy. "Oh, I was just hanging out with my boyfriend." We made small talk, and my initial apprehension was put at ease. The driver then told me it wasn't exactly safe to be out and about at this hour, and that I should be more careful. I nodded, but as I said before, I was an arrogant 16-year-old who thought she was invincible. As my stop approached, I looked down at my phone. It read 11:30 p.m. My battery was down to 5%. Wow, that's not great, I thought to myself. I exited the bus and said goodbye to the driver. He told me to stay safe, and I gave him another nod as the door folded back shut. For some reason, I just stood there and watched the bus make its way down the street until its taillights were well out of sight. As I stood there at the empty bus stop, a sensation of what I can only describe as impending doom washed over me. I made my way to the bench to sit down. The bus I needed to go to that dropped me off near my house was scheduled to arrive at 11:40, only 10 minutes left. As I sat there staring off into space, thinking about some things I had to do when I got home, a black SUV pulled right up to the bus stop. The uneasy feeling I had earlier intensified, but I did my best to play it cool. The man rolled down his window and called out to me, "Hey, excuse me, do you know what time the bus is supposed to be here?" He appeared to be a mix between Hispanic and Asian and had a medium build. At this point in time, I did not make the connection that this may be the same vehicle I saw just before I boarded the first bus. I figured he was probably waiting for somebody, so I replied that it would not be long. He then asked me how long I'd been waiting. It was then that I started to get a little bit freaked out. This guy was really giving me the creeps. I considered if I might just be overreacting. Perhaps he was just trying to pass the time. Still, I kept my guard up. I answered that I hadn't been there waiting long. He proceeded to try and make more small talk. I was trying to be polite, but I also kept looking at my pitch-black phone screen, trying to subtly hint to him that I was not interested in conversation. It was dark out by this point. The only luminescence was coming from some nearby street lights. However, there were also two big trees outside the bus stop, positioned in such a way that they blocked out most of the light. If this guy tried anything, the dark would have provided decent cover. I nervously clenched my phone, with the uncomfortable feeling inside increasing with every passing second. He told me he was new to the area and didn't know his way around too well. He claimed that he was in the army and was stationed nearby. He then asked me where the beach was. "It's just down the street," I told him in a very matter-of-fact way, as to convey that maybe he should go there instead of talking to me. It was then that our eyes met, and I could see his face very clearly. His eyes were not like a normal human's eyes. It was as if they were looking right through me, staring at me like a hungry fox who just discovered a trapped and defenseless rabbit. He then asked me, "Would you mind showing me around a bit? Come on, get in the car for a little while." I may have been a naive 16-year-old, but I was not an idiot. I knew that if I got in that car, that would be the last time anyone ever heard from me again. I was trying my best to show him that I wasn't afraid, so I politely declined while looking down the street for my bus. He then began to beg and plead. It was kind of pathetic, honestly. I told him no once again. He then said something that I'll never forget. "Come on, baby, it won't take long." At that moment, my blood ran cold. My stomach felt like it was going to drop right out my side. I felt absolutely sick, like I was going to throw up. Thankfully, at that moment, my bus was appearing in sight and coming down the street. A feeling of relief washed over me. I told him no, once again thinking that would be the end of it. He then told me he would drive me right home afterward. This guy would just not give up. I finally had enough. With all my strength and courage in me, I shouted at him to leave me the hell alone and called him a fucking loser. As my bus pulled up, I heard him say something genuinely terrifying, and I quote, "Fine, shit, I'll just follow you and see where you live." My heart started to race, my hands broke out in a cold sweat, and my body began to tremble with fear. I quickly got on the bus. Honestly, I don't know why I didn't tell the bus driver. I think I was just in a state of shock. I was hoping that Mr. Boyspade Hunter in the SUV didn't mean what he'd said, and he was just pissed off and trying to scare me. When I sat down and looked out the window, though, I saw the headlights of the SUV tailing the bus. I thought I was going to have a mental breakdown. When the bus finally arrived at my stop, I ran like I reached the front door of my house, which was usually unlocked. Tonight of all nights, though, it was locked from top to bottom. I frantically rang the doorbell while going through my bag to find my keys. I heard someone pull up out front. Without turning around, I knew who it was. Just like in the movies, I dropped the keys I was trying to put into the front door. I finally managed to unlock the front door. Before turning the handle, I heard a car door slam shut from behind me. I quickly ran inside and slammed the door shut in a panic. I explained to my mother and my older brother what happened. My brother ran outside and looked up and down the street. I was shaking, absolutely consumed by terror. My emotions finally got the best of me, and I could no longer hold back my tears. We called the police, and they came and searched the area. They asked me if I'd gotten a tag number. Unfortunately, I had to tell the officers that it was too dark to see. I did notice a sticker of some sort of bird on the backseat driver's window. It didn't dawn on me until right then that that had been the same SUV that was parked across the street when I was with my boyfriend nearly an hour prior. They told me they'd checked the army base nearby and the surrounding area, but nobody had seen any vehicle matching the description I gave. All I could think about was what the bus driver had said to me and the irony of what took place on the same night. Years went by, and I didn't think much about that incident after that night. One day, I was scrolling through Facebook when I came across a picture. My friend had posted it. It was a story of a man who had been following her home from work for the past 3 days. It was the same guy I'd encountered 5 years prior. My heart felt like it was going to leap out of my throat looking at that post. I noticed that several other women had come forward, and they all shared similar experiences to mine. I ended up finding out that he almost kidnapped a 13-year-old girl. She allowed herself to be lured into his car, but once inside, she noticed a roll of duct tape, some rope, a pair of gloves, and a bottle of what turned out to be chloroform on the floorboard. She ended up jumping out the window while they were stopped at a red light. I don't know all the details, but apparently he also got physical with a woman who was pregnant and tried to force her into his car. He got pretty ballsy and started trying to abduct women in broad daylight. The news found out his name was Leo, and it was discovered he had a wife and 2 daughters who were around 3 and 5. They interviewed his neighbors, and to my surprise, they defended him, saying that all these women were just lying. It's truly unbelievable how stupid and useless people are. 5 separate accounts from 5 different people who have no connection with each other came forward and shared their experiences. Could you please dislodge your head from your ass and face up to the facts? Anyway, to this day, I have no idea whatsoever became of him. The last I heard, he was still at large. I hope they caught him, so no other young woman have to be subjected to this monster ever again. I was about 15 minutes from finishing the night shift at work when there was a massive crash in one of the windows in the office. I got up to go check it out, only to see that someone had thrown quite a sizable rock through one of the windows on the front of the building. This was especially weird because I was working in the industrial district at 11:30 at night with none of the other businesses opened. I went back to my desk and put a quick call through to security to let them know what happened. At that point, I decided it would be best to head home. As I was leaving the building, I was freaking myself out about it more and more. I ended up running to my car and getting in and taking off as fast as I could. I was almost home, and I'd started to calm down a bit when I realized I did not unlock my car when I got in. It had been unlocked the whole time. I did a quick check with my hand in the back seat, but there was nothing there. Fast forward 30 minutes. I called a friend of mine who said he was out drinking at a bar nearby. I decided I was going to go join him. I jumped on my bicycle and started riding over. I was riding along the road on my bike. It was quite a nice night, and I was in no big rush. I was just enjoying the moonlight when I began to hear someone riding right behind me. I straightened up and stuck to one side of the road. This guy passed me by really slowly, and when he was right beside me, he shot me a big smile that I can only describe as purely insane. I kind of flinched, and I was taken aback. I realized he was riding on my mom's bike. Needless to say, I turned around and went home. When I got there, sure enough, her bike was missing, and one of my car doors was open. This person must have somehow been hiding behind me the entire drive home. This happened about 3 years ago during summertime. I was riding my motorbike in the mountains of Gifu. All morning long, it had been very bright and sunny out. Then suddenly, the pitter-patter of rain started up out of nowhere. I came across a rest stop area and pulled in to take a short break. In the service area, there was a toilet and some shops in a building with a wooden roof. There was also a table and a little bench in what looked to be a little hut. As I was using the toilet, the rain really began to pour down, and thunder started to echo through the mountains. The rain didn't seem as if it would stop anytime soon, so I thought I'd better change into my emergency raincoat. I took off my backpack and headed towards the sheltered hut. While I was getting my raincoat out of my backpack, I put my other things down on the table. I casually glanced up, only to see an elderly couple sat right opposite to me on the bench. They hadn't been there just a second ago. When did they show up? I didn't really care about that too much, though. I was more worried about when this thunderstorm was going to stop already. I stared at the sky for 2 to 3 minutes, trying to figure out what this crazy weather was going to do next. The elderly couple that had showed up out of nowhere didn't say a single word. Things started to feel a little bit uncomfortable, a little awkward, if you will, so I tried to break the silence. "This rain started up real suddenly, huh?" The old man talked to me in a dead flat voice. It's always raining. It only just started to rain, though. What the hell was he talking about? They both looked at the sky and not at me, so I didn't get a good look at their faces. "Man, if I don't take a quick rest, I'll never make it home," I said. The old man paused for a couple of seconds and said, "I really feel for the ones who won't make it, huh?" What a weird thing to say. I could suddenly hear some voices shouting in the distance. When I looked around, the old couple had disappeared. That's all I can really remember. Next thing I know, I was jolted awake. I opened my eyes to find I was being shaken by some random guy. He looked about 30 years old or something. "Hey, are you alright?" He looked very concerned while he was shaking my shoulder. I asked him what was going on and what had happened. He said he'd seen me when he pulled in to use the rest area's toilet. Apparently, I was climbing over the safety railings onto the mountain path close to the wharf. I was stood dangerously close to a cliff's edge. He said I looked completely dazed and disoriented, so he had to jump over and stop me from jumping off, or whatever the hell it was I was going to do. I really have no recollection of that, though. I must have been unconscious for all of 2 minutes at the most. I still very clearly remembered the rain, but as I mentioned it, the guy who saved me from jumping off the cliff edge said that it hadn't rained at all that day. "Well, yeah, it must have been raining because, look," I pointed to my raincoat only to discover that I didn't have it on. I looked around me and there were no puddles, no wet ground, or any sort of sign it had been raining either. The summer I turned 27, my boyfriend of 3 years invited me to stay over at his parents' place for a week. They were heading off on some month-long vacation around Europe, so they asked him to watch their house while they were going to be gone. A big reason was they needed someone to take care of Buster, their 7-year-old beagle. Instead of staying there all alone, my boyfriend asked me to come keep him company. It was super fun having all that privacy, and it was kind of emotional too, seeing how things might play out if we stayed together and achieved our career goals. It was also summer, and with both of us being teachers, neither of us had any real commitments or anything like that. While Jay's parents were in Europe, we had our own little staycation right there in that house. I arrived on Friday evening and stayed all the way until late Thursday night, only occasionally heading home to grab a change of clothes or something out of my fridge. That Thursday, we stayed in bed until late in the morning, then headed out to get brunch at our favorite spot. I ordered my usual and he ordered his. It was a nice little brunch date like that always put me in a great mood. I was walking out of the cafe shop and back towards his car. I was in a really good mood at that point. I distinctly remember, though, the moment I lost some of that good feeling, having spotted a guy across the street sitting in his car and very clearly staring at me. I did a double take just to make sure I wasn't imagining things, but no, there he was just staring back at me with this vacant expression on his face. I didn't want to say anything to Jason, my boyfriend, just in case things escalated and it ruined our day for no reason. Once we were safely back in his car, I told him about the guy who was staring us down. He reacted exactly how I expected him to, kind of mad at first, but then trying to make light of it by telling me how pretty I looked. I didn't mention it to him, but that wasn't the kind of look the guy was giving me, like he was trying to stare at me because he found me hot or something. It was just this expressionless 1,000-yard stare, like he didn't give a crap if I knew he was staring or not. That was definitely the creepiest part. We got back to his parents' place, hung out some more, and playfully argued about where to order takeout from. We had a generally nice afternoon together, and dinner was quite good as well. I won with my suggestion of Korean food. Once again, a nice time was had by all. With us being teachers, we were conditioned to have an earlier bedtime. So, after a few glasses of wine and a little bit of Big Bang Theory, we took a shower together and then went to sleep. As I mentioned earlier, we were taking care of Buster the old beagle that I had come to absolutely adore by that period of my stay. He was just so chill and friendly to everyone. I swear, I had never seen a dog so hungry for cheese of all things. Buster had apparently gotten pretty smart in his older years too. Whenever he needed the bathroom, he'd just walk up to the back patio doors of the house, sit his butt down, and just stare at you and whine if you didn't immediately get up to let him out into the yard. It was cute and very polite of him. I remember that night waking up and needing to pee really bad. When I was in the bathroom, though, I could hear Buster whining. There was no scratching, but he was still whining at the door. After I finished with my business, I figured I'd go let Buster out to have his. Right as I got to the top of the stairs, though, I saw him right there in his doggy bed, not by the door. He was still whining all the same. He was also not lying down in his bed like he'd usually be doing. Instead, he was sat bolt upright. There was only a little bit of light going downstairs from the hallway I was in, but I could see him looking up at me, just like he'd do if he needed to go to the bathroom. I walked downstairs to him and said, "What's up, buddy?" Right then, when I got to him, he turned his head to look at something in the TV room. He kept staring until I too looked in that direction. There, sitting on one of the two couches that faced each other, was a man wearing dark clothing and a ski mask. Before I could react, he had a gun pointed at me and gestured to the couch in front of me, then told me to sit down. It was like I wasn't in control of my own body anymore. I knew I shouldn't do what he was telling me. I knew I should run or try to scream, try to hide or anything to avoid getting with arm's reach. I still did what he told me, though. I sat down on the couch and tried to speak, tried to tell him that we'd do anything if he wouldn't hurt us. Instead, he cut me off. "Is Jason here?" The fact he knew my boyfriend's name, I can't even begin to describe how much that terrified me. If this was just some random break-in, they might at least be happy with some money or valuables or something like that. But knowing my boyfriend by name meant this must be personal. I did the only thing I could. I lied and shook my head. I remember how dark the guy's eyes looked in the low lighting, and how they never blinked once. After I shook my head, he then asked me in the same whispered voice, "Why is Jason not here if his car is parked outside?" Again, I felt that same terror. He must know Jason quite well. What the hell was he into, though, that a man with a gun would come breaking into his parents' house in the middle of the night? I think what scared me more than anything was not knowing what happened to get us into this kind of mess in the first place. I could die never knowing what Beale had done. Just 1 minute I'd be there wondering in horror, and the next there'd be nothing but a void of unanswered questions. The masked man asked me again if Jason was there, and more specifically if he was upstairs sleeping. I knew it was pointless to lie again, so this time I said nothing and did nothing. I just waited for whatever came next. Maybe he might shoot me and go upstairs and do the same thing to Jason, or maybe he'd just walk right past me and I'd have to listen to the last moments of my boyfriend's life. Instead, the guy seemed to take a completely different persona all of a sudden. He stopped pointing the gun at me. Not completely, but not directly at me anymore. He then sank back into the couch and asked if I knew why he was there. I shook my head in response. I remember how he laughed silently to himself and said, "Of course not." That was one of the few times I found the strength to speak, and although I wanted to ask him why he was there, all that came out was a simple, "Please don't hurt us." The guy leaned forward again and then told me in words that'll stay with me until I die, "I'm not gonna hurt either of you. I was gonna. That's the reason I came here. I was gonna shoot your boyfriend. You know why?" I shook my head, and he instantly responded, "Because he's been cheating with my wife." It was only then that I noticed he had something in his other hand, a folded up piece of paper. He then put the gun on the armrest of the couch and unfolded it, then put it down in front of me. I saw it was some kind of collage. Each picture was of some kind of text message exchange from an app called Telegram. That was all except for one, which showed the contact details of one of the participants. It was Jason. It was 100% him. I assumed the other participant was the guy's wife. I don't know why he brought it with him. Maybe to show Jason so he couldn't deny it away. Maybe to show someone like me so they'd know it wasn't just some kind of mistake. Either way, once he'd successfully broke in and bumped into me instead of Jason, he decided against the second half of his plan. That's something I consider to be divine intervention, because I'm certain if it was Jason that had woken up and gone downstairs to check on Buster instead of me, he would have died right there before I even knew what was happening. Because it was me, though, someone the intruder saw as an innocent party, it gave him second thoughts. He got up to leave. I was filled with a wave of relief so strong I could have burst into tears. "So, I guess you're gonna call the cops now, right?" I shook my head for what seemed like the 20th time in minutes. "Nah, now you're gonna do it, and I'm dumb as fuck for doing this in the first place." I felt a few last pangs of anxiety as he walked towards the patio doors, which were ever so slightly ajar. He must have somehow gotten in without waking us up that way. Now that I think about it though, maybe he did wake me up, and that's when I realized I needed to pee. I guess that's neither here nor there though. The last thing I said before he walked out was a really shaky thank you. I realize now that I was thanking him for 3 reasons. Firstly, it wasn't a thank you, so much as trying to confirm he wasn't about to change his mind and kill both of us. Second, it was a thank you for not hurting us. But thirdly, it was actually me thanking him for telling me what Jason was doing. At the time, I felt very protective of Jay, and was glad he wasn't hurt. I know that somewhere in there, though, he had planted a bizarre seed of gratitude in my head. After I thanked him, he stopped, looked back, and said he should be thanking me right now. I feel a kind of crazy guilt typing this out, but my first instinct was to call the cops. There was no guarantee he wasn't going to change his mind and come back. I don't know if he'd been drinking or was crazy or anything else that might cause him to do something he'd regret. That's when I stumbled back upstairs on trembling legs, grabbed my phone, and called 911. Jason woke up in the process. It took a few minutes of describing what happened to the operator before I was able to ask Jason about the events. The moment I did, I knew it was all true. I'd spent 3 years with him learning all his little quirks and tells. I could read his facial expressions like a book. What Jason's face said to me after I asked was, "How do you know about this?" He tried to tell me he didn't know what I was talking about. The guy was obviously mental ill with some sort of delusions or something, and the cops better get there quick. I even remember him calling me baby over and over. All that I felt in that moment was that I stopped loving him. It was a sick joke. I think it was the way he used that threat to our lives as a perfect excuse to try and not talk about Melanie. How he'd been playing his hide the salami with her for the past effing who knows how long. He kept on saying stuff like, the only thing that matters right now is we're safe and everything can wait. I don't know if I had ever felt that kind of anger before. And when the cops finally arrived to take statements from each of us, I had to struggle to keep myself together. It might sound kind of weird, but I don't really blame the guy for being as angry as he was. If my ex-boyfriend had kept his junk in his pants, there would have been no reason for anyone to plan any messed up revenge killings. Sure, the guy should have gone about it in a responsible way, but we don't live in a perfect world where everyone else does everything they're supposed to, and none of the stuff they're not. If they did, I might not have this terrible memory now. I'm a nurse who works the night shift, and there have been 2 different occasions when I've been stalked on my way home. I'd like to share them with you. This happened when I lived in Chikawa, Tokyo. I was returning home on the last train of the night. It was around 12:30 a.m. or so. When you get off the train and exit the subway, there's a convenience store right at the top of the stairs. My apartment at the time was about 7 minutes away from this store, in a residential area. At that time of night when you get off the last train home, the lights of the convenience store are pretty much the only light source in the area. The roads are usually empty as well. Back to the story. I was climbing up the subway stairs when I noticed a man waiting at the top of them, staring down at me. His eyes widened further and further as he stared at me. He was shifting around restlessly. At that moment, I knew something was weird about this guy. I ignored the traffic lights and crossed the road as soon as possible. I took a quick look over my shoulder and decided quickly to walk home, since the situation was abnormally creepy. As I was walking, though, I felt a looming presence behind me. I looked back over my shoulder once more and noticed that weird guy from the entrance of the subway was following me. He was closing the distance between us without any hesitation. I instinctively started running. I remember running like crazy. I was so panicked and frightened. There was no one on the streets to help me, not a single car passing by, and it was so dark everywhere. I remember I ran up a path onto someone's private garden and pushed the gate aside. I hid in their yard as I crept around the back of the house. I peeked around the corner back at the road. I saw a taxi pass by, and I saw my chance. The taxi driver must have seen how scared I was because they slowed down right away, and that really saved me that night. After that startling event, I moved into an apartment right in front of a different train station. This area was one that was much safer, as it had a 24-hour taxi and buses, and was well lit. It was also busy with many people, even during the nighttime. It was much more reassuring. I had been living in this new place for about 2 years when something else happened to me. Of course, it took place when I was coming home from my night shift. Back in those days, when I left the hospital to go home, I used to take a shortcut through this dark alley. It was there that I was certain I met the same man once again. I remember quickly heading to the train station and boarding my train when I noticed the man once more. As I sat down, I could tell a man was staring at me. Some guy had followed me onto the train. I had a terrible feeling about this. This guy kept glancing at me and fidgeting around in his seat. The train pulled into my station. I got as close as I could to the doors, and as soon as they opened, I ran out as fast as I could. I sprinted to an exit I knew would be busy. I even took off my jacket and tried to blend into the crowd of people. When I thought I found a safe place to hide, I looked over my shoulder. Sure enough, he was right there behind me, desperately searching the area to find me. I knew how much danger I was in. Luckily, there was a police box at the west exit of the station. In the following days, I became paranoid that man might know where I lived, or might wait to ambush me in a more well-hidden place next time. I told the police everything I could about the man. One of the officers seemed familiar with the man I was speaking of and described him as a real pervert. When he said that, shivers went down my spine. There are a lot of young nurses in Japan who work late like I did back then. It's been 10 years on now, and I still get creeped out thinking about those nights. As peaceful as Japan can be, You really have to be careful when walking home at night, especially if you're all alone. I remember it was about 9 p.m. and the kids' parents would be getting home in about an hour. I had put the kids to bed and I was downstairs watching TV by myself. Every so often though, the TV would flicker with static. To be honest, it was kind of starting to scare me. It wasn't until the point when I looked up from the TV and out of the nearby window when I lost it. There wasn't actually anything outside, but it seemed as if in the reflection, I could see what looked to be a tall man standing not too far away from me, behind the couch. Needless to say, there was not actually anything there. When I snapped my head to look at the spot where it had been standing in the reflection, I didn't find anything. I grabbed all my stuff and wanted to get out of that house then and there. Instead, I ran upstairs and actually sat down quietly where the kids were sleeping until the parents arrived back home. I particularly remember when the parents arrived and I had started to leave. I was pulling out of their driveway in my old Ford when I looked up into the kids' bedroom window. I saw the same reflection I'd seen earlier, looking back down at me with a hand raised as if waving goodbye. After that incident, I never babysat anyone ever again. Going to see my family during the summer is quite fun. Traveling 3 days by car, after getting there, we would have about 3 good weeks ahead of us to spend in Nebraska. I myself am from Pennsylvania. I was really excited when my aunt asked us to stay with her. I mean, she was a pretty good aunt. We were already 4 days into the vacation, and I wanted to stay up late one night. I opened up my laptop and decided to Skype my friend Brody. We talked for about 2 hours until my aunt's dog suddenly started barking upstairs. I'm ashamed to admit I grabbed the dog and told him to shut up. Brody and I continued our conversation, but the dog would not stop barking. This time, I chalked it up to probably being my sister, who had just come in through the door. I felt a bit relieved that she was here now, but she went right to bed. It was now about 2:45 in the morning. Brody and I had already finished our conversation. As I lay there trying to get some sleep myself, the dog began barking once more. At this point, I was getting quite annoyed. I wanted to go to sleep and I was exhausted. Right as I was about to get angry though, I heard a tapping on the window behind me. I was in the living room and there was this glass window, a large one that made up a majority of the wall. I was already a bit creeped out thanks to the dog's barking, not to mention I was not that familiar with my aunt's place. When I heard this tapping, I was expecting the worst. It was common for drunks to wander around this area. The place was almost infamous for it, so when I turned around to look at what was out there, I was expecting some random drunk to be tapping at the window. Yeah, my aunt lived a little too close to the bar for sure. Sure enough, as I turned around, I could see at the window there was a bald man staring in at me. I jumped out of my skin when I saw him. He looked sweaty and dirty. He was swaying about back and forth. He indeed looked to be very drunk. He then tapped again even though I was already looking at him. He began speaking to me, muffled by the glass. "Hey there, don't be rude to your dog. I heard everything you said to that poor thing. Just because it's barking doesn't mean it's your worst nightmare. That would be me." He then started this freakish laugh, as if he thought that was the funniest thing in the world. He then bolted away as fast as he could around the side of the house, looking like he was about to trip the whole time. It was a bit too dark to actually see his face, or where he'd actually gone. I wasn't entirely sure if I should call the cops or wake someone up. Sure, you might say it was some drunk playing a prank, but this guy really seemed to want to scare me. It makes me wonder what he might have done if there was no wall or glass separating us. Alcohol does tear away your judgment and your inhibitions. That incident made me realize that no matter where you are in the world, nothing is really perfectly safe. Not unless you're in a place with people you absolutely know and trust. The last thing you want is to experience that sort of thing. So be safe out there, everyone. Be sure to shut your blinds and be nice to your dog as well. After my parents got divorced, I really disliked being with my dad. My mom and dad still lived in the same neighborhood, although not really close together. I spent most of my time with my mom, although I did have a room at both of their houses. My dad had gotten really depressed after the divorce. He spent a lot of the time that I was with him drinking and not really paying much attention to me. I only spent the occasional weekend over at his place, and only when he really insisted on it. Since I was spending Christmas with my mom, he insisted I spend the weekend before Christmas over at his place. My parents arranged all of that. I was around 10 years old at the time. I think that's important to know if you're to understand some of the decisions I make in this story. It was a pretty lousy day ever since I walked home from school to my dad's place. It had been snowing pretty heavily all day long, so walking to the house caused my feet to get pretty soaked because of the snow. Once I arrived at my dad's place, he had already begun drinking, so the night was not going so great. The only thing I did like was the fact it was snowing outside. I sat at the window drinking hot chocolate and watching the snow fall. My dad drank so much that he eventually fell asleep in his easy chair. It wasn't unusual, but it made the night as bad as any other. I was only 10, and I really didn't know what to be doing in the house basically by myself. It wasn't the first time that I completely had to take care of myself, but I didn't really like it. It seemed like I was wasting my time and my night being here at this house. That's when I got the brilliant idea that I should just walk over to my mom's place. I had made the walk before. It was a bit long and I wasn't supposed to be out so late at night. Maybe my mom might be asleep or out of the house at the moment, but I could not stand spending any more time here with my passed out father. I bundled up as best as I could with what I had on hand, and then I set out into the snow. It had been really snowing hard, and it had been building up on the ground this whole time. That made it a much harder walk out there than it had been walking home from school, but I was determined to make it back to my mom's house. I was moving really slowly through the snow. As I walked by each streetlight, I saw just how hard and heavy it was really falling. A few times I felt I should turn back around and go back to my dad's house, but I figured it would be fine when I eventually made it home. I had gotten maybe about halfway when something happened. A door opened suddenly and an older man came out onto his porch. He started talking to me, asking me if I wanted to come into his house and get warm. He said it was way too cold and wet out there, and that if I came into his house, he could call my father for me to come and pick me up. I waved him off, telling him I was fine. I was just trying to get home, and I could make it there all on my own. And that was when he started offering me things like hot chocolate and fudge if I came into the house. He was making me feel uneasy. I was not supposed to talk to adults I didn't know. I wished I could have walked faster, but I would have had to walk in the street for that, and I wasn't allowed to do that either. I wanted to get away from this man. As I tried to go on, I kept note of him from the corner of my eye. The man began coming down his front walk quickly, coming right for me. I didn't think much about it, but I got scared out of my wits when he suddenly grabbed me by the arm. He started trying to pull me toward the front walk, and I knew he was trying to get me into his home. I was terrified, and I struggled my best to get away from him. I began screaming out and yelling at him to let me go, but the guy was dragging me, and he was a lot bigger than me. He was winning easily. There was no doubt he was going to get me inside his house. I got extremely lucky, however, as a snowplow just happened to be coming down the street at the same time. It caught the attention of the man dragging me. I was able to use the icy slickness of the sidewalk to knock him off balance and throw him onto his back. I then jumped over the snowbank separating the sidewalk from the road and in front of that snowplow. The man who grabbed me got up and started running back towards the house. The snowplow stopped, and a big man got out of the cab. I ran over to him and told him the man in that house had just tried to abduct me and asked if he could help me out. The driver let me into his truck and used his phone to call the police. He waited in front of the house until they arrived, which took a while. When they arrived, they went and confronted the man in the house. He was arrested for attempting to abduct me. The police then took me to my mom's house. I did get in some trouble for attempting to walk in the first place. Mostly though, my parents were both happy nothing bad happened to me. That was the closest call I ever had in my life. I had to do a long drive across the US to get back home after visiting a friend of mine. I was 19, so naturally I was convinced I was invincible. I'm a woman and had pulled into a mountain town. It was about 11 p.m. or so, and I was super tired. Although I was only 3 hours away from home now, I knew it wouldn't be safe to continue driving. For reference, I'm 5'2", and I had plenty of cash on me at the time. I booked myself in for the night at the motel. It was really quiet, with only 2 vehicles in the parking area, one of them being a large white van. I know how that sounds, but I didn't really think anything of it. I mean, maybe it was the clerk's van, and he needed it for transporting things or something. The clerk was a man, and I immediately got a sketchy vibe from him. He seemed more bent on trying to creep me out for some reason. His idea of making conversation was to immediately say, "A young girl like you ought to be careful. You know, these trees have witnessed many things around here. Pretty young things like you disappear all the time." I know that sounds like a horror movie, but believe me, that's what I felt like in the moment. I think he was prompted to say this because he asked where I was headed, and I was deliberately vague with him, just saying I was going somewhere important, but I needed to rest before I continued. The clerk kept pushing. "Well, are you traveling alone?" I said yeah, it's just me. He then gave me this ominous warning. He was tall and skinny, and had ginger hair and really dark brown eyes. He reeked of cigarette smoke. In fact, the whole check-in area stank of it. He told me he would be at the desk if I needed any help. I was too tired to dwell on things any further. I went to my room and made sure my door was locked up and the windows were all covered. The room didn't smell too bad, and nothing seemed that weird. That is, until I realized that none of the lights inside were working. I used my phone as a flashlight and went to the bed. There were cigarette butts all over it, and the pillows were also wrecked. I could see stab marks in them, and they looked filthy, just full of grime, as if they hadn't been washed in ages. I realized there were also cigarette butts inside the pillows where the stab holes were. I felt incredibly uneasy, but I told myself not to be ridiculous. I mean, that sort of thing happens at motels all the time, right? I couldn't ignore that uneasy feeling developing in my stomach, though. I pulled the covers back, and at least the sheets were clean. I decided to sleep without anything over me. I lay there for about half an hour, but no matter how tired I was, I could not doze off. I was creeped out by every single noise from outside. I kept telling myself to chill out. It's just an unfamiliar environment, but I could leave right after a few hours of rest. Daylight would be here before I knew it anyway. I must have eventually dozed off at some point, but not for very long. I awoke with a start, my heart hammering in my chest. The door was being knocked on. I grabbed my phone to check the time and saw it was 1:15 a.m. I had not been sleeping for very long. Obviously, I felt uneasy. I mean, who the hell would be knocking on my door at this time? There were no people around, and I had the curtains drawn so I couldn't see outside. I was scared to look, yet I knew I had to. I got up very cautiously and gripped my phone, ready to use it as a weapon if need be. I moved the curtain aside, and I could see the outline of a tall man. I realized it was the clerk. Confused and still feeling on edge, I opened the door slightly. I was still shielding myself so he couldn't burst in. His face was blank, and he just stared at me. "Hello?" I looked down at his hand and realized he was holding a cup. It was one of those takeout coffee cups you get in cafes. It had a lid on it, and I couldn't tell what was inside. He held it out to me and said he knew I was tired from my trip. He thought he'd get me some caffeine to help me wake up. I was confused. I didn't answer due to my confusion. He gestured toward me again, and I finally just said, "What?" He looked at me and explained he got me coffee because I was so tired from my long drive, and he wanted to help me out. My uneasiness spiked to new levels. I felt a sense of dread creep over me. I told him that was nice of him and all, but I would be fine after a good night's rest. Thank you anyways. I went to shut the door, but he wedged his foot inside and insisted I take this drink from him. I'm not stupid. I don't care if it sounds paranoid. I know better than to accept a drink from a stranger, especially this guy, in these circumstances. Instead of insisting on declining, though, I decided it would be best to accept it and not drink it. I took it from him, afraid he would grab my arm or something. Luckily for me, he didn't. He smiled a sinister smile at me and told me to take it easy before he walked away. As he did, I quickly shut the door and locked it behind him. I stood at the curtain, staring outside. I saw him go over to the white van in the parking lot and jump in the passenger side. I took the lid off the coffee, and only then did I realize it was not very hot at all. I wondered how long it had been sitting for. It did smell like coffee, but I also thought I might have smelled something else. I knew better than to risk taking a sip of it. I wasn't sure what to do. I was afraid to leave in case he ambushed me or followed me to my car. It wasn't that far away, but they could still come after me in his van if I drove out, or run at me in the lot. What if he had other people waiting and watching me? What if he came back later? Surely he knew I'd locked the door, so even if he did judge me, he wouldn't be able to do anything. I mean, he could. Maybe he had a master key to all the rooms or something. Or he could smash the window and jump in. So many scenarios and questions were running through my head. And I was way too frightened to go to sleep. I felt like I was in a horror game. This was my safe room. I knew I had to get out of here and fast. By the grace of God, the bathroom windows were quite big. The motel rooms were on the ground floor, so I had an idea. I left the coffee on the floor of the main room and went into the bathroom. I'd looked in there before sleeping, but I hadn't paid close attention to the windows. I reckoned I could just about squeeze out of them. It was above the bathtub and not very high up. I knew I had to try. It would take me out behind the building. I opened it as wide as I could and hoisted myself upward. I managed to get out thanks to being short and thin. I landed hands and face first, but it didn't matter. At least I was out of the motel room undetected. I had my phone in my jeans pocket, so it was safe as well. Thankfully, it didn't get smashed or anything. I crouched down and crept slowly to the edge of the building. I could see into the parking lot. I knew the clerk still had to be in the van, but of course it was way too dark to really see anything. It was then that I thought about how he'd gotten into the passenger side, meaning someone else was behind the wheel. Had they been there when I arrived? Was this all a pre-planned thing? I had to take some deep breaths to calm myself down. I didn't have strong cell phone service. I could have tried calling the cops, but the signal was just so weak up in these mountains. It was even worse where I stood at the back of the motel area. I was scared the light from the phone would attract unwanted eyes to find me. I hid away behind the motel for a long time. I was too afraid to move. I knew I had to time this perfectly or something disastrous could occur. I had to abide my time. It was really bitterly cold outside, and I was shivering, but I had to stand there and wait. I stood for a long time. I don't know how long, until I heard a noise. I carefully peeked around the side of the building, where I saw the white van's thin doors open. The clerk got out with another man, who looked similar to him. They disappeared out of sight. I darted out of sight too, petrified. I felt incredibly vulnerable, and my heart was racing. I could hear movement, but I wasn't sure what they were doing. I heard footsteps approaching. Then I heard the clerk talking to the man. "I'll knock." I then heard knocking on the motel door. I knew it had to be mine. I could barely breathe. I was so scared. Another voice then talked to him. I think it worked. This voice was higher than the clerk's, with an eerie calmness to it, as if they were talking about the weather. I knew in that moment the coffee had something in it. I heard the jingling of keys as someone fiddled with them. A sinking feeling came over me. I was right to think it was possible the clerk had some sort of master key that would open the door despite it being locked. If they went in and didn't see me there, would they check the bathroom? I hadn't shut the window behind me. It was still wide open, so they'd find me. I knew I had to act now and fast. I couldn't mess this up, or I was done for. They were clearly planning something very sinister. I heard the footsteps enter the motel room. I darted out, refusing to look back. I couldn't hear anything around me except my own heartbeat. I jumped into my car and sped out of the parking lot without daring to look behind me at any point. I was trembling, but I couldn't stop. I knew I had to drive no matter what. I didn't stop driving until I got home. When I finally arrived, I just sat in the living room. I was shaking until 5 a.m. My parents were still asleep. When they woke up, I told them everything that happened, and they called the police. I didn't sleep until like 11 that day, and I had to wake up at 1 p.m. The police took me seriously. They went to the motel that I described, but they didn't find any evidence of wrongdoing. The van was there, but there was nothing inside of it. The clerk was there, but he was apparently alone. There was no sign of another man, and the coffee was long gone. Apparently, my motel room only had a single sheet and nothing else inside. I begged the police to do something, because this guy clearly had a plan set up for me, but they told me there was nothing else they could do. It's been a few years since all this happened, and it put me off from motels for life. I don't like driving super long distances anymore either. I'd much rather stick to getting on a plane to take me wherever I need to go. I feel like the stars aligned for me in that night. In some ways, I'm lucky I'm short, even though I've always longed to be taller. I'm not sure a taller person would have fit through that window. I ignored my instincts a little, but at least I knew something was up, and I was on edge enough to be aware. I'm so glad I didn't drink that coffee. I feel lucky he didn't insist I drink it right in front of him or something. I really hope nothing like this happens to anyone else. I worked at a women's clothing mail-order catalog call center. During training, a veteran worker was talking about getting to know the frequent callers and the story of one of them. This old lady used to call in often. She was blind but would have someone help her pick things out. The manager of her apartment complex, I think. She would order often, and they got to know her by name. Eventually, she stopped calling in, so they contacted the number they had for her, which was the apartment manager's number. The old lady was perfectly fine, but she had moved to a new building. Even though she was blind, she was very meticulous with her cleaning. She cleaned everything often. The manager had come in to do some maintenance for the first time in many months, and noticed that in every room of her apartment, just above her head level, there were thick webs and nests of black widow spiders, hundreds of them. Can you imagine an oblivious old lady walking around blind in a house she thinks she's made spotless, but there's a soul-freezing nightmare swarming all over the ceiling? Needless to say, they had to get her out of there before she ended up getting bit by one of them or something. Thankfully, the old lady is still alright to this day. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.